So, you want to make a Fanganronpa. Then, welcome to episode 4 of my series on how to do exactly that. In this video, I'm going to go over some tips and methods I've used and seen to make the presentation components of Fanganronpas, such as sprites, CGs, UI, music, and so on. Disclaimer. I am not an artist. Like, at all. The best I can do is some mediocre sprite edits, so in terms of art advice, I'm not the right person to talk about it. Which means it's time to call in some assistance. Hello, art friend? Help me talk about art. Thanks.
Hello, I'm Mad Dinosaur. I do art, and I also don't normally do this sort of thing, so apologies in advance. I wanted to start this off with a quick disclaimer, which is, I am absolutely in no way a professional. I am a 17-year-old high schooler who is entirely self-taught, so please do not take my words as gospel. I can say something here and some of you will be thinking, hey, that's totally wrong, and that's absolutely fine. I'm speaking from my own experiences participating in both Fanganronpas and other collaborative art projects. This is simply something like a helpful guide, and not rules you have to follow or your whole project will fall apart or whatever. Alright, we good? Perfect. Now, let's get into it. A common misconception within the Fangan community is that in order to have a good project, you have to have the most amazing god-tier level art ever, otherwise your Fangan will totally flop. And I'm here to tell you that is absolutely not true. Majority of Fangans are visual novels, so while the visual aspect plays a lot into it, you need to understand the sheer amount of time and effort a lot of the art takes. To put this into perspective, let's say, for example, we have Bob here. Bob is an artist. He's fairly competent in what he does and has a fair amount of experience. Bob has just been recruited to work as an artist on this Fangan. The writing part has been covered, so all Bob has to do is make the art. Easy, right? Well, let's consider what Bob's tasks will be. The average Danganronpa game consists of usually 16 different characters. Each one has their own unique sprites, with many poses and expressions. This can range from someone like Sakura, who has about 12 sprites, all the way to someone like Maki, who has roughly 56 sprites, give or take. This will be a time-consuming challenge for Bob, but let's say this is maybe a Fangan that uses pre-existing sprites. This can mean characters from the Danganronpa games, or even other visual novel games, like Ace Attorney or Zero Escape, or even taking pictures of characters and editing them to work as sprites. That can sometimes work too. That's certainly a weight off of Bob's shoulders, but now we have to factor in the CGs. The very first chapter of Danganronpa V3 contains around 30 CGs, give or take. Let's say Bob takes about maybe 3 to 12 hours to complete a CG depending on the complexity. If we roughly calculate that would be around 270 hours of work, which is equal to about 11 days, in the first chapter alone. This is obviously crazy and unrealistic for one person to complete alone, but we're not done. On top of the CGs, there is also things like evidence, splash art, closing arguments, and the oh-so-dreaded executions that Bob will have to do, spanning across roughly 6 chapters. Yeah, thoughts and prayers to Bob. Asking this of 1 or maybe 2 artists is downright quite unreasonable. Many Fangans are not made for financial gain, so a lot of them are not being compensated for this work. Most of the time, if you approach any random artist asking for them to do the near impossible task of making all the art for your Fangan for free, you will be turned down. There's of course the solution of simply getting more artists, but unless you have particularly generous artist friends or get incredibly lucky, it can be quite challenging to recruit many artists for Fangans. There are a huge amount of time and commitment, and most people will be skeptical of putting their faith in a project with little to no work to show for it. Regardless of your Fangan, unless it's not in a visual novel format or you have ways around it, you're going to need a fair amount of art. But there are ways around this workload that I can point out here. Danganronpa Defiance on Instagram handles executions differently. There is art for them, but rather than being fully animated videos, there's still pictures with descriptions beneath of the execution. Executions are easily one of the most intimidating parts about any fangan artistically, since many are animated, but Defiance handles them in a less time-consuming, efficient way that doesn't take away from the experience. Another thing to point out is that you absolutely do not have to have your art be exactly like the Danganronpa style. Countless of fangans use their own original and unique art styles. You don't need to have art be just like the canon games, unless that's what you're going for. Just a reminder, it's not required. Teams are great for art in fangans. Not every fangan will have the luck of having a whole art team, but this is for those that do. While there can always be some issues with managing a team, overall it can help lighten the load. Fangan art can be divided up into 5 different stages, a pipeline if you will. These stages are sketching, line art, colors, shading/lighting, and finishing touches. Each of those are fairly self-explanatory. Having a person assigned to each of these roles, or multiple roles, example, doing both shading and line art, can be great for making things consistent overall. It can increase the speed of production overall too. Each artist may have a different skill set, of course, but one of the easiest cheats you can have is coloring. Many beginner artists, or even non-artists, are capable of coloring. Literally, almost anyone can do this with a palette, and it can take a huge load off of other artists. Make schedules too. Know what to expect in certain amounts of time. It can be easy to underestimate the amount of time fangan art can take, but let me tell you, it can take a while. Unexpected things can happen, and you always need to take that into account. Take things one step at a time. Keep things consistent overall. Make sure to have references for original characters close at hand. Know their heights in comparison to each other and each of their finer details. Know your canvas sizes too. That can go a long way. I haven't touched much on specific art tips for people planning to draw themselves. We'd be here far too long if I did a whole tutorial, so I'll just go over some more general tips. Watch tutorial videos. You can find a lot here on YouTube, and you'll be able to find some catering towards the Danganronpa style. Use references. One of the biggest helps for me is being able to reference canon Danganronpa art for drawing CGs in a Danganronpa style. But this also applies to drawing anything, buildings, pencils, you name it. Never be ashamed of using references. Be open to tips and suggestions, especially when working in a team. It can be easy to overlook things at times. And my final biggest piece of advice is keep at it. Creating art for fangans can be rough, but it's always so satisfying to see everything come together. But all the same, know your limits too. There's no shame in needing breaks, because life can be unexpected. Understand what you're capable of in certain time frames and what doesn't work with you. And that's about it from me. I hope this was all at least a tad helpful to some of you. Leave any specific questions in the comments, and remember to like and subscribe. To Barbie, not me. Bye!
Once again, thanks to Mad Dinosaur for contributing to this video. Be sure to follow her at the links in the description. I'd also like to share some tips from Sweden, the lead programmer for Project Eden's Garden. He once again emphasizes the art pipeline, which has already been touched on in this video. He also pointed out the importance of sprite resolution if you're going to be using a game engine. That resolution should be divisible by 4, for example, 2048 by 2048, or 1024 by 1024. You should also have a height chart for all of your characters, so that their sprites can be scaled correctly in comparison to each other. Another tip is in regards to 3D modeling. In Trigger Happy Havoc, a lot of the assets were actually 2D images placed in a 3D environment. This creates a sort of pop-up book look, and is a good workaround if you or your team isn't very skilled in modeling. Next, I'd like to go over UI, or the user interface of your fangan. This includes things like the text box, chapter icon, other symbols like these, and just the general layout of the screen. Most of my advice here follows general graphic design principles. Choose colors and patterns that fit the general look you want for your game. For example, in V3, the paneling and dots inside the windows are reminiscent of comic books. I'd also like to highlight this video by Crosspaw that has some very good tips on editing your fangan, linked in the description and the card. I make my graphic elements in Photopea, which is a free online photo editor. But there's several programs you can use that will be completely sufficient. as long as it's not Canva. As I've said before, don't use Canva. To show you some of this advice in action, let's make an example frame for Fanganronpa. Okay, so this is an unscripted portion of the video where I'm going to show you the general steps I went through when making assets for my Fangan. Quick disclaimer, this is just how I made slides for an Instarampa. If you're making a video series or a game, the actual process will be completely different, but a lot of general tips will still apply, I hope. So the first thing I'm doing here is getting my references. These are usually screenshots from the game or general patterns and motifs that I want to include. Since Velma was the protagonist of Fanganronpa, I'm pulling from Scooby-Doo a little bit. You'll see I use a bone pattern in the design of the UI and incorporate the shape of Scooby's dog tag into what I will later talk more on, which is what I like to call the protagonist window. The next thing that I'm doing is putting in the backgrounds. This is obviously, again, going to depend greatly on if you're using backgrounds from the game, using your own backgrounds, whatever. The way I have my UI screen set up is with multiple layers. So I want to do it in the style of V3. So I have the general background, that's the one behind the colored overlay that takes up the entire screen. And then you have the character window, so the character who is usually speaking or interacting with the protagonist. And I zoom in that background a little bit to give it a sense that the camera is panning to that character. Then you have the protagonist window, where I usually try and get another angle of this background or just some part that's not super visible and clip it to that layer to make it look like the camera is facing the protagonist in that shot. Speaking of the overlays, that's the layer setting that I do for the colored part that goes between the panels and windows. Again, kind of like the V3 way of doing it. This isn't really in Sugar Happy Havoc or Danganronpa 2, but I tend to like using it. And then I also overlay the pattern I want on that, so the bone pattern, for example. Then there's the text box. I'm being very lazy in this and just using the Danganronpa existing text box, but you can do whatever you want. I'd recommend doing kind of whatever you want, as long as it looks nice and is readable. Yeah, keep in mind, this is a very lazy example. I'm just going over more process things versus trying to make this look perfect and flawless. So if it looks kind of bad, that is why. But yeah, so make sure your text box is the right size, a good placement, all that jazz. Then your protagonist window, I was gonna originally do it on the right side like V3, but then I thought it looked better on the left side in this specific instance with the shape I had chosen, so I decided to move it over there. Kind of reminds me of, I think Persona did that. Draw inspiration from other games that you like if you think that's a good idea. Be creative with it, you know? Think about your location and the general atmosphere of your Fangan and try and incorporate that into the UI. Because I think that's a pretty creative way to show more of your atmosphere. For your text, you want to make sure it is visible and legible. So don't use a color that is hard to read. Don't use a font that is hard on the eyes to read, because visual novels are a lot of reading. And if it is strenuous on the eyes to try and read every frame, it's not going to be an overall very pleasant experience. Also, be sure to check for spelling and grammar. Having a beta reader is a good way to avoid this pitfall. Or just most writing programs have built-in spell check and grammar check. So be sure to utilize those. I am not perfect about it. Almost every chapter of my Fangan had typos. They're a little bit to be expected, but in general, you want to try and avoid those as much as possible. And the last thing I want to touch on, specifically for Instarampas that I don't see utilized a lot, but I think should be, are clipping layers. Most art programs should have this feature. As you can see in Photopea, it's represented by an arrow and a slight indent on the layer. And when turned on, it essentially masks the image to the layer beneath it. So it will only appear on whatever space the layer beneath it takes up. And this is great because it stops things like unnatural overlaps if you have a character with very big sprites. So like Donald Duck, for example, here doesn't actually need this in this specific pose because he's already within the confines of the character window. But if I wanted to move him for some reason far off to the right, you'll see that looks weird. It looks like he's going into another layer. And I don't like that, so you turn on clipping, and you'll see that he only appears in the window that I want him to. This just makes it all look cleaner, and I think it's a tip that I haven't seen very much, so I wanted to share it here. Finally, I didn't do it on this example, but this is also where you can add your symbols and other elements, like a music icon, or what chapter you're on, if it's day or night time. All that stuff would also go on this UI screen and follows the same general principles that I've talked about so far. So yeah, I hope this was a little informative on how I make Instarampa slides, but I hope the advice can carry over a little bit into designing UI for whatever kind of Fangan you want to do. Finally, let's talk about sounds. If your project is a video or a playable game, it's probably going to have music. This is also something I'm not super familiar with, but this video, by Everything Fantasy, helps highlight some of the tools and tips in composing music in the Danganronpa style. That said, some projects just use the soundtrack from the games themselves. There's nothing wrong with this either. An important thing to keep in mind that I touched on in a previous episode is not being afraid to scale down. You don't need an original soundtrack to make a Fangan, but it can be a great way to make your project stand out. Regardless of what tracks you use, how you use them is incredibly important. Study the games and see what kinds of tracks play when, like how in the first game, Beautiful Days accompanies free time, while Buzzkill is played in those dreadful moments before a body discovery. Appropriate use of music can really set the mood for your scene. The same can also be said for sound effects. An appropriately timed impact sound, or the chime of the monitors, really bring to life what, in essence, is just a bunch of static images on a screen. And with that, I've touched on everything I want to talk about regarding your Fangan's presentation. This is definitely a very broad topic, so I apologize if this episode was a little bit less structured than usual, but I wanted to share some basic tips that have helped me when making my Fangan in the past. The next episode will be the final one in the series, in which I'll go over the specific questions that I've gotten from you guys. So be sure to leave some down below in the comments. See you soon!